Well, good morning, everybody. Okay, it's great to see all of you. Good morning and welcome. It's July 21st. July 21st. Welcome to our fifth program in this summer's Summer Forum Speaker Series here at the First Unitarian Church. Before I proceed, let's hear from our guest musician today, guest pianist, Tristan Moore. Thank you, Tristan. Okay. Some quick reminders before I introduce this morning's speakers. One is that we're going to try to keep that door closed just because we're recording this, and so it helps with the sound system to keep the door closed. So if you need to exit, if you'll exit through the rear, okay? Second is that after our speakers' presentations, which they'll do from up here, we'll have the offering. We'll hear from Tristan, and we'll then go to questions and answers. And during that period of time, Kathy will be on that side, I'll be on this side. We'll have portable mics. If you wish to pose a question, just raise your hand, nod to us. We'll try to be as fair as possible in terms of alternating, but also getting to you in terms of sequence. So those first early hands are very, very helpful. Okay, so with that in mind, let's introduce this morning's speakers. We have Elise Lazar, and we have Tom Huckin. And Elise, and I'm going to go straight to my phone. Elise has been active with the Utah affiliate of National Move to Amend since its inception in 2010, 9 years ago. She served for 8 years as chair of the mayor's Green Team and has been the recipient of the Gandhi Alliance for Peace Award in 2016. She recognizes that change can take place quickly, but more often it takes vision, determination, and long-term commitment. When people thank her for her efforts, she's inclined to say, quote, "I appreciate your thank you, but would be more grateful if you would join me." Okay? And she has a wonderful quote from Anne Frank. Quote, "How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world." Anne Frank. Tom Huckin. Tom Huckin is a retired professor of English and writing at the University of Utah, where he specialized in the study of contemporary propaganda. He's now a community activist and a keyboard warrior. Since January this year, he and his wife, Christiana, have been new members of this congregation. And I'm going to quote from the Salt Lake Tribune this morning, page 02, the opinion section, a letter to the editor from Tom Huckin. Hardly, and this is entitled Racist Track Record. Hardly a day goes by when our president doesn't put on display his deeply ingrained racism. The most recent example is his telling 4 outspoken new congresswomen to, quote, "go back to where they came from," unquote. The fact that they are all people of color escapes no one's attention. That's the beginning, and at the end here, if fellow Republicans publicly denounce the current occupant in the White House, I can't say his name, racism, it might alter his behavior. Yet none of this state's congressional delegation has done so. Such silence, final paragraph, such silence can easily be interpreted as endorsement, especially by those elements in our society who share the current occupant of the White House's bigotry. It's not only morally shameful, it's destructive to the well-being of this nation. So with that in mind, let's welcome our 2 speakers this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. I don't need to tell you that we are living in momentous times. The climate crisis, exorbitant health care, income inequality, racism, gun violence, nuclear war, it goes on and on. All of these issues and more are threatening the well-being of this nation. More than ever, we need a government that will address these things and work to ameliorate them. Instead, we have a political system that's becoming more and more dysfunctional. In the initial forum of this summer series, Rocky Anderson addressed a number of these issues before singling out campaign finance as a root cause. He didn't have time to elaborate, but Elise and I have the next 30 minutes at our disposal. So that's what we want to do today. We will argue that the massive amount of big money in our political system, especially since the Supreme Court's infamous Citizens United ruling of 2010, has had an enormous corrupting influence, a corrupting effect that is not fully appreciated by most citizens. Indeed, big money corruption is so pervasive that we no longer have real democracy, but a facsimile of one, what might be called a counterfeit democracy. Here are some facts about how big money has taken over American politics at all levels. When Eisenhower was elected in 1952, the total cost of all federal elections for president and Congress was $23 million. In 2016, the latest full election, by contrast, it was $6.5 billion, almost 300 times greater than in 1952. Compare that to national elections in other developed countries, which cost only a fraction of that. In Germany and France, for example, elections cost about $150 million. Do the math, and that's about 2% of what ours cost. 2%. It's well known that on most issues, politicians listen not to their constituents, but to their largest donors. I'm talking about inserting loopholes, earmarks, special provisions, and the like for the benefit of only those private donors and corporations. According to one study, the biggest 200 corporations in America benefit by an estimated $760 for every $1 they invest in a politician's campaign. If only we could all get that kind of return on investment. If you're thinking that things are better on the state level, think again. States are notoriously lax about campaign funding. Indeed, 4 states have no limits at all. And would you guess, Utah is one of them. That's right, Utah has no limits on campaign contributions. It's interesting to note that our state's legislators get most of their campaign money from non-constituents, people who can't vote for them. In last year's elections, for example, incoming legislators collected only 6% of their campaign donations from voters who actually live in their districts. The lion's share of contributions, 82.4%, came from special interest groups, corporations, and out-of-state donors. By the way, it's a similar story for Utah's congressional delegation. Last year, for example, Rob Bishop got 92.6% of his campaign funding from corporations and wealthy donors located outside of Utah. That put him #1 in the entire U.S. Congress. Sort of a dubious ranking, but there it is. Mia Love was close behind. Currently, a Provo entrepreneur named Jeff Birmingham is thinking of running for governor. Thinking. Though he has not even filed for candidacy, he already has more than $570,000 in his war chest, thanks to Fat Cat donors. In Salt Lake City's last mayoral race 4 years ago, the 2 finalists spent a combined $1.4 million. This year's race has already surpassed $1.2 million with almost 4 months to go. As PBS commentator Mark Shields said recently, quote, "Money is the mother's milk of American politics," unquote. He should have added, without the nutritional value of the real thing. Why does this matter? It's said that he who pays the piper calls the tune. In our political system, it's wealthy interests, not we the people, who are thereby calling the tune. The massive amount of money going into our political system is clearly having a corrupting effect on how we citizens are governed. When the International Corruption Perception Index was initiated back in 1997, the U.S. ranked 15th in the world. Now, today, we've fallen to 22nd, just 1 spot above Uruguay and the United Arab Emirates. Interesting to be competing with the United Arab Emirates for something like that. The latest report notes a continuing decline ever since Citizens United and cites, quote, an increase in conflicts of interest and private influence, unquote, as a major reason for the decline. It notes that America's ranking has dropped precipitously just in the past 2 years under our current regime and could well drop further. Such corruption affects our elections and governance in a number of ways. First of all, it forces candidates and members of Congress to spend an inordinate amount of time, more than half of each working day, on fundraising instead of concentrating on the work they were elected to do. Second, as I mentioned earlier, it leads to members of Congress often voting not to represent their constituents' best interests, but to fulfill promises made to wealthy donors. As a result, little is done about issues rated most important by the U.S. citizenry. In this way, we voters are effectively disenfranchised. Evidence of this undemocratic system can be found in a major 2014 study by 2 Princeton and Northwestern political scientists who studied 1,779 policy issues debated in Congress during a 21-year period ending in 2002. They found that big business interests and wealthy elites had disproportionate influence on federal legislation compared to the bottom 90% of income earners. This is hardly how a democracy is supposed to work, and the authors of the study point to campaign finance as the root cause of the corruption. Not surprisingly, most ordinary citizens are not unaware of their political impotence. When queried, many Americans readily say that their vote, quote, doesn't count, unquote. A rough measure of that disillusionment can be found in voter turnout compared to other nations. Turnout in the economically developed nations is typically 70% or more, while in American elections it ranges from only 40% in midterm elections to about 55% in presidential year elections. That, according to Pew Research, puts the U.S. near the bottom of the 32 most economically developed countries. For all these reasons, the United States now ranks 25th on the Economist's annual Democracy Index. In fact, it is no longer even recognized as a true democracy, but as a, quote, flawed democracy in their ratings, on par with Estonia and Chile. So let's talk about this. What do those true democracies do that we could emulate? First of all, their election day is typically a holiday, not a work day, which makes it easier for voters to go to the polls. Second, they have more parties and candidates to choose from than we do with our two-party system. Third, their campaigns are much shorter, usually less than 6 weeks. Also, they are largely publicly financed. They have limits on campaign spending and TV advertising. It's like a dream world I'm describing, it seems. Yeah. They have disclosure requirements. There's no dark money, and so on. We could learn a lot from them, but we don't. The deluge of big money in American politics keeps getting worse and worse with each election cycle. Why is this? What accounts for it? The simple answer is that big money interests, especially large corporations and super wealthy individuals, find ways around the federal laws designed to prevent such corruption. The basic history goes like this. In the late 1800s, lawyers for big corporations pushed the idea that since corporations were legal persons for business and litigation purposes, they should have Bill of Rights protections, including the First Amendment right to freedom of speech. A century later, in 1976, the Supreme Court ruled that since political campaign speech requires money for its dissemination, especially in today's modern world, with electronic world, such spending itself should be a protected right under the First Amendment. Finally, in 2010, the Supreme Court merged these two notions. In the infamous Citizens United case, the court ruled 5-4 that since corporations have a First Amendment right to unlimited freedom of speech, and since money is needed to convey such speech in the political domain, corporations should be free to spend as much money on political speech as they like. The court's majority acknowledged that handing truckloads of cash directly to a candidate might be seen as bribery. In fact, that's why there's a $2,600 cap on what you as an individual can give to a candidate for federal office, for example, and why there's a $5,000 cap on what a political action group or PAC can give. So the court majority specified that such contributions to be legal should be done in a more discreet way. As long as big money interests don't give truckloads of cash directly to a campaign, they said, it's okay. Such, quote, independent expenditures, as they called them, would not give rise to corruption or even the appearance of corruption. Let that sink in. Just let that sink in. Needless to say, big money instantly seized on this loophole and created the super PAC, which can raise unlimited sums of money from corporations, unions, associations, and individuals, then spend unlimited sums to overtly advocate for or against political candidates or issues. They simply can't donate any money directly to political candidates or coordinate their efforts with the candidate's campaign. That's the key differential. A local example of this, I think, although I could be wrong, was Reagan Advertising's campaign against Ralph Becker in Salt Lake City's 2015 mayoral race. And you may recall seeing billboards around town and boosting all the mayoral candidates except for Ralph Becker. Needless to say, the idea of non-coordination between super PAC and candidate is extremely fuzzy and easily evaded. Super PACs quickly became the funding vehicle of choice for both parties, only making the big money problem worse. But even that was not enough for many big contributors. Contributors to a super PAC must disclose their identity, and many well-heeled corporations and individuals don't like doing that. They're somehow embarrassed to be seen supporting the candidacy of someone like, say, Donald Trump. And so, guess what? They created the handy-dandy scheme of dark money. It works like this. Let's say you're part of the private prison industry, and you like the Trump administration's support for profit-oriented prisons. You want to give big bucks to Trump's campaign, but not have it traceable to your company or industry. What do? Instead of donating your money to a pro-Trump super PAC, which would require donor disclosure, you launder it through a so-called social welfare organization, or 501c4, which is allowed by the IRS to spend up to half its treasury on political donations without any donor disclosure. Surely there's some Trump-friendly 501c4 out there, maybe the National Rifle Association, for example, that's all too happy to do that. In the last 12 years, such dark money spending has exceeded $2 billion. Jane Mayer's 2016 book by that title, Dark Money, is the definitive account, and I urge you all to read it. I also recommend the film Dark Money for a case study from Montana. On the internet, see the website opensecrets.org, sponsored by the Center for Responsive Politics. Is there anything we can do about this? You bet. And many citizen activists around the country are taking action. And I now turn the microphone over to Elise, who will give you fascinating stories about some details.
Thank you. Are you all depressed? So now comes a slight beam of light, a glimmer of hope in this darkness. Yeah. So there are some positive forces, some coming even from legislators themselves, and some from ordinary people like us who are hell-bent on reclaiming democracy. Groups are arising, all with a slightly different perspective on how to move forward, but with the common goal of getting a more equitable system. Our group is Move to Amend. A tiny bit of background. Even before the devastating January 21st, 2010 Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, there was a group of individuals representing various organizations who shared the concern of the rising influence of money in politics. When the ruling came down, they were prepared. They quickly recruited young leaders from across the United States and brought them to Humboldt County, California, for training. Move to Amend was then born. Our Utah affiliate was actually started by one of these young leaders, a firebrand by the name of Ashley Sanders. The core concern of Move to Amend was that the Citizens United decision disrupts the democratic process by opening the floodgate to unlimited contributions, granting expanded, disproportionate influence to corporations by the wealthy. The ultimate goal was, and still remains, the 28th We the People Amendment, which states that corporations are not people and money is not a form of free speech. The amendment which would, pardon the expression, trump the court's decision. Today, there are 44 Move to Amend affiliates across the United States charged with persuading their congresspeople of the importance of this nonpartisan issue and gaining their support as co-sponsors. It is a daunting task, where 2/3 of the House, as well as the Senate, must be co-sponsors, and then 3/4 of the states must ratify. Now, our particular affiliate was and is unique in that we are, if not the reddest state, then certainly one of them. To convince then Senators Hatch and Lee, Representatives Bishop, Chaffetz, or Stewart to be on board with the 28th Amendment was, we felt, a waste of our time. We knew that ultimately the goal is to remove the corrupting effects of too much money in politics, and that is the overriding challenge. But we decided to focus on other means of accomplishing this. So we decided to focus locally, starting with Salt Lake City. Our first decision was to launch a citizens' initiative whereby an issue initiated by the public can be put to a vote. This would serve as a vehicle to educate the public as well as to strengthen local democracy. It was a petition drive where we gathered signatures with the goal of placing the 28th Amendment on the ballot. We were 100 strong and energized, but we only had 60 days to gather the required 7,141 signatures of registered voters. That's 10% of the number of citizens who had voted in the previous presidential election. It was a daunting task and a real eye-opener as to the limitations of the freedoms that we're supposed to enjoy in the United States. For example, although it is a public building, we could not gather signatures in the atrium of the public library. We had to go outside the library, but then that required a city permit. The post office, which we had been told by National is a fine place to gather signatures, it's a federal building, but we learned that it was off limits, as was the parking lot in front of the post office, which we were told was private property. We were told the same outside stores at Foothill Shopping Center. That was owned privately, so we were not allowed to gather signatures there either. Can you imagine? And on. Really, the only places we were permitted were the parks, which we inundated. At the end, we had gathered 11,251 signatures, far exceeding the required number. We were just elated. We were victorious. We were going to be on the ballot. Until the city attorney, who had initially given the green light to move forward, came to us saying that the small print read that because we were not calling for a change to an ordinance, which is a city law, but asking for a resolution, we could not be put on the ballot. Can you imagine how shocked we were after all that effort? We appealed this decision to the Utah Supreme Court, and we lost. We had several meetings with the city's legal counsel. He and the city council recognized that they had a moral obligation to the citizens who had signed the petitions. They offered a unique and very interesting solution, an opinion question, which had never been done before, would be sent out to all registered voters in Salt Lake City. The cost, $90,000, absorbed by the city. The question, should corporations be given personhood status, and should money be considered a form of free speech? The response, overwhelmingly in our favor, 89% opposed to Citizens United. A formal ceremony with Mayor Ralph Becker and the City Council was held, and the resolution was signed. So now, with signatures on the petition, as well as the results of the opinion question, there was no doubt of the support of the citizens of Salt Lake City. And with this mandate, we set to work, tackling the challenge of too much money in political campaigns. We compared contribution levels in 35 cities comparable in size to Salt Lake, and we discovered that we were excessive in what we allowed. In the mayoral race, the allowable contribution here was $7,500, one of the highest limits in the country, 3 times the amount that an individual can donate to a presidential campaign. We analyzed other areas where there were irregularities, and at the end we submitted a proposal requesting consideration of 4 significant changes. 1, the mayor and city council should have the present allowable contribution amount. 2, those who had or were vying to have contracts with the city should not be permitted to contribute to candidates running for city office. 3, no contributions were to be accepted from corporations. And 4, a war chest, money left over from previous campaigns, shouldn't be returned to contributors or given to a nonprofit of the elected official's choice, so that it could not be held over to be used for the next campaign cycle. We then enlisted many speakers representing the diversity of our population to speak at the City Council meetings on behalf of our proposals. Ken Sanders, bookstore owner. Boyer Jarvis spoke, past president of the University of Utah. NAACP President Janetta Williams, to mention just a very few. We also met with individual council members. And so, after 4 years of truly indefatigable effort, at the final meeting of the City Council in 2015, it was announced that yes, individual contribution limits would be changed from $7,500 in the mayoral race to $3,500, and from $1,500 to $750 for those running for City Council. Additionally, anyone who presently had contracts or was vying to have contracts with the city was prohibited from contributing to a candidate. 2 successes out of 4. A long, hard fight, but we had won. We had, at least on a local level, achieved campaign finance reform. But we're not done, of course. Since then, we've connected with the then newly elected Park City Mayor, Andy Bierman, who initially and enthusiastically said, "I'm right with you on Citizens United. It's evil. But wait a few months and let me get my feet wet." Only to be told when we attempted to meet with him that now that he was mayor, his hands were tied and he could not meet with us. That's called going from wet feet to cold feet. Disappointing, to say in the least. We recognize that another effective means of getting money out of campaigns is the possibility of public financing of campaigns. This is where the funding of elections is not through massive and uneven amounts of private money, but through smaller amounts of evenly distributed public money. Public financing is not only commonplace in elections around the world, but has been gaining ground here in the United States. Currently, some 13 cities, 3 counties, and 15 states offer taxpayer-financed public funding for candidates who agree to a severe limit on private donations. The oldest such municipal program is New York City's, that was created in 1988. A study done by the Brennan Center for Justice found it increased voter interest and created a demographically broader field of candidates. And so, with public funding in campaigns in mind, we have met with Jim DeBacchus and with then County Mayor Ben McAdams, and now are continuing that pursuit with Jenny Wilson. Additionally, education remains foundational for us, with Tom giving monthly interviews on the radio in Moab, leading to a public forum in October, where we will be showing the movie Pay to Play. We also proudly partner with Alliance for a Better Utah, the League of Women Voters, both of which share our commitment to getting big money out of politics. And in terms of the ultimate goal of the 28th We the People Amendment, we are moving forward asking the public to sign cards, which we will then take to our current federal congresspeople, showing your support, acknowledging that this is indeed a bipartisan issue, and urging them to join with the present 53 congresspeople who are already on board as co-sponsors in this critical bill. It's exciting, but it definitely requires a long-term commitment and recognition that the stakes are too high to fail. And now, things that you can do. Be informed and actively engaged, which I would say at the Unitarian Church you all are already on board with all of that. There are so many issues to be concerned about. Recognize that money in politics is foundational to the corruption that allows these issues to be unresolved. Go to town hall meetings. Ask candidates questions like, if elected, would you support the proposed 28th Amendment, which overrides the Supreme Court's 2010 Citizens United decision? Or, what are your thoughts about dark money? Or, please identify your top 3 campaign donors, including PACs and super PACs, and how much each has given. Whew. Write letters to the editor to the Tribune, and don't forget the Deseret News. Consider posting a reader's comment to a letter to the editor, making the connection between the issues brought up in their letter to the corrupt influence of money in politics, and tie it to Citizens United. Call or email your congresspeople. Ask them directly if they would sign Joint Bill 48, which is in Congress right now. Remember, that's the bill that relates to the We the People Amendment. It's easier than you think. When you call, a staffer answers and simply writes down the issue and tallies the number of callers, pro and con. By all means, attend hearings and rallies. There's strength in numbers. Donate to, or even better, create the time to be active in an organization that addresses the problem. Move to amend. Free speech for people, Represent Us, End Citizens United, Alliance for a Better Utah, League of Women Voters, to name just a few who are fighting too much money in politics. And finally, recognize that even if your heart is in the right place, unless it's connected to your feet, no change will take place. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, we're going to hear from Tristan during the offering, passing the plate. And this also gives you an opportunity, if you want, to stand up and maybe shake hands with your neighbor. Okay? Okay, everybody, it's about 12 minutes before 11. We're going to move ahead with as many questions as you may have. We're looking for that first question. Kathy on that side, me on this side. Looking for that show, and I see it right there. First question.
Congressman Rob Bishop promised that he wouldn't run again. He was going to retire. And he reached the point where he can't hold Republican office anymore. And then he said, because of popular demand, he's going to reconsider and may run twice more. So my question is, what happens to the money? What happens to the money when someone retires with a campaign war chest?
Yeah, that's the war chest problem. And in our, as Elise mentioned, for the city, not for the state like in Rob Bishop's case, but for the city, that's something we wanted to avoid, to have a war chest like that left over, because you can have these candidates who stay forever and they just get more and more money, they accumulate more and more of that money, and it cements their reelection, basically. And in some cases, they're so confident of being reelected that they can take some of that war chest money and then spread it out among fellow party, other politicians, candidates of the same party. So it has a very insidious kind of effect that's hard to trace. So that's why there should be, I think, in campaign finance reform, there should be a limit on. Elise and I both agree and move to amend. We agree that there should be a cap on this kind of war chest accumulation. Yeah,
question right here.
You mentioned in your presentation public financing, and a simple question, wouldn't it be easier to beef up McCain-Feingold public financing than going for a constitutional amendment? You might recall that in 2003, the Supreme Court in McConnell versus the Federal Election Commission upheld McCain-Feingold in all important respects. And McConnell is the McConnell we know and love, who was Republican whip at the time in the Senate. And even though they upheld it in all respects, the real problem with it is that the amount, in my opinion, non-humble opinion, the financing offered candidates to forego private contributions is too small, which of course is why Barack Obama, despite his pledge, very quickly jettisoned complying with McCain-Feingold. But the simple question is, wouldn't it be better just to beef that up and make public financing competitive with what might be available in terms of private contributions?
It's about, yeah. The answer is, I mean, yes, certainly the public, if the levels of public financing were raised, were increased to be competitive with that kind of private money that you're talking about, then yes, that would be one way of dealing with it. That would run into resistance, of course, from taxpayers or citizens who don't want to have, the government funding more and more stuff, so this increase of taxation would require some increase of taxation. So the alternative is to do what European countries do, is to put caps on and limits and so on campaign, the length of a campaign, the amount of money that can go into it, all these different ways that big money can find its way into campaigns. In other words, you're saying that there needs to be more of an equation between private and public money, and that's certainly true. And what I'm saying is that it could occur in either way, either direction.
Yeah. And I want to add also that we touched on, but didn't really go into the length of our campaigns. And you should know that Donald Trump, on the day that he was inaugurated, filled out the forms so that he would be considered as a presidential campaign in the 2020 election. That's almost 2 years of allowing him to campaign, which he has been doing since he's taken office. So we really need to limit the amount of time that a campaign should be run.
Question here?
I read about this meeting this morning, and that you were going to be here, and I love the Unitarians, and I thought, I really need this input. In the real world, it works like this. Last week at the Greater Avenues Community Council meeting at LDS Hospital, there was a great crowd of people, and afterwards I went along, and the senior patriarch of a giant billboard company came up to me and said, "So, where do you stand on billboards?" You have been against us in the past. They were putting some billboards down on the scenic byways, and I did everything I could to stop it, so he knew what the answer was. And I said, look, I wouldn't tear them all down, but I don't like them. And this man said, do you know that we spent $350,000 in the last in the last mayoral election, and we'll spend whatever it takes in the next one. So you think about that a little bit, young man. So in the real world, where I have been raising money and my opponents have been raising money since January at $150 and $3,500 a shot, and after all of that, I've raised $247,000. And now somebody comes along and says, I have a business, and I don't care about any other issue. I care about my business, and I'll match whatever you spent to get what I want for my business. And then guess what I've seen over the last week? My opponents One has $80,000 worth of billboards up, another $60,000 worth of billboards. People ought to know that it's not just in this one area, but I think sometimes those political signs are, people ought to ask, where did the money come from them? And one other quick thing to get your comment on, look, all of these limitations, there's ways around them. People have said to me, Jim, I'll give you a bunch more money for different services. And then you can put it down as an expense. If you win, you pay me. If you lose, you don't have to pay me. Because I'll tell you, there's no $350,000 in that billboard company, either on their donations or on a PAC they started. There's a lot of shenanigans. And who is somebody supposed to take to say there is a problem here? The Attorney General? Really? So I'm saying thank you for the input. Thank you for what you're doing. This is an issue that affects every other thing. How easy it would be to say, are you kidding? 350 grand? I'll put billboards wherever the hell you want. And nobody would know the wiser.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds a lot like the Reagan advertising campaign that I was mentioning. So I don't know if it's the same person that you're talking about, Jim, but it sounds fairly familiar. I mean, it's very similar. Yeah, and that's how super PACs work. And I don't know if Reagan advertising actually constitutes a super PAC or not, but it operates in the same kind of way. So in other words, if they don't contribute directly to a candidate's campaign. In this case, Reagan Advertising was out to get Ralph Becker because he is an urban planner and he had long been publicly offended by this slew of, this pollution of billboards all around our beautiful city. And so that was well known, and so Reagan Advertising went after him with a vengeance. And they gave money not direct money, not directly, but in the form of free advertising on billboards all over the city. And I recall seeing virtually every mayoral candidate during that race except Ralph Becker getting promoted by Reagan billboards. So it is, yeah.
Question is here.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for this today. It's so important and informative for all of us. I'm just going to ask this question because it needs to come up and it's too big to answer, but we should just have it on record that it came up. How does all this apply to the inland port?
Yes. Oh my goodness, have I gone to hearings and protests for that? We always know to follow the money. We don't know exactly at this point, but there are people who are looking into it, exactly what the legislators who are responsible for this horrible, horrible idea that for a whole slew of reasons should not go forward. But we are also sure that they are either getting promises of campaign contributions or in some way are making money on this. So thank you, Kathleen, for bringing that up.
You mentioned that Mia Love was right behind Ralph Becker in terms of contributions, money. And Rob Bishop. What did I say?
Rob Becker.
I'm sorry. Rob Bishop, yes. Well, my question is, how did McAdams defeat her if she had so much money?
Oh, my goodness. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but thank God he did. I don't know. Do you have any understanding of that?
I don't have any hard and fast information. So it'd be speculative, but I mean, he ran a really good campaign, and, you know, I think she had accumulated some baggage, you know, politically and so on, and so, yeah, so money doesn't always make the difference. I mean, it can be defeated with a good campaign. I think that's probably what happened.
Shar, do you want to respond to that?
Volunteer hours on the phone and door to door. Every time I went into the phone bank for Ben McAdams, it was packed with people. And we covered the district.
Oh, well, thank you for that. And you see, there you are. People have to get on their feet and follow their heart with their feet. Yes, thank you.
Question is here.
Hi there. Oh, sorry. Can I be permitted to ask a more kind of general question, not necessarily focused on Utah politics? So in our system of government, in order for legislation, particularly on campaign finance, we need to get the support from legislators. And we've had this discussion of the war chest, sort of this dark money. I feel like with politicians, there's going to be this sort of sunk cost effect. If I support these bills, I'm not going to be supported by corporate entities, and I'm not going to be able to meaningfully address my ideas or become reelected because I don't have the funds or the support. So outside of moral obligation to the government, what incentives do you guys see as potential incentives for politicians to support the legislation we're talking about?
I would answer that people are understanding and are so upset, are really disgusted with what's happened, that I think that a candidate who actually comes forward and says, I am not taking money from corporations, I want to distance myself from dark money, from super PACs, has a leg up because the voters want somebody who finally stands up and says, I am a moral person. So I think we need to recognize that although they may not have the money for advertising and so forth, they are the kind of people that we want to represent us.
Let me just add that in the current presidential campaign, you may have noticed that there are a number of candidates, among those 20 or so Democratic candidates, there are a number who have made a point of saying that they're only going to accept small donor contributions, or they're going to accept largely small donor. They're making putting emphasis on small donor donations, is what I'm saying. That's becoming more and more common, popular, I think, among national politicians. So that's a very good sign. That's a sign that the most prominent national political candidates are sensitive to the general public's dissatisfaction with the status quo.
Okay, my question is during the, actually the last presidential election particularly, and since then, as you check out of the grocery store, in virtually every store I was in, had tabloids and magazines that were politically slanted with outrageous claims. I'm concerned that this last-minute push doesn't allow time for any clarification or rebuttal. And I can think of ones very clearly that I knew were false and not true. And so I'm wondering if part of this effort is to to cover up these last-minute ads that cannot be contested, defended, or proven false, as some of them were. And particularly, we moved here from upstate New York, where Hillary Clinton was our our representative for a while in Congress, and she visited often. And some of the things that I saw in the last-minute tabloids were just not true of her. We had seen her recently, and it was extremely disturbing that this kind of slanderous information is put for everyone walking out of the grocery store who may not be able to check that out. And I'm not saying that she was the best candidate, at the time she was, but I'm looking forward to other candidates. But it bothered me a lot seeing a last-minute smear campaign for every person who is buying groceries.
I concur. And they have it so perfectly timed that, of course, you're right. There's no time to defend yourself. But also, it's so distressing to me that good candidates are put in the position of having to defend themselves instead of moving forward with their platform and with good things. But it's all part of the manipulation.
Yes, you mentioned earlier, I want to get back to the inland port, because what can we do about that? And I think I know about your idea about fans. Could you share that?
Oh dear, really?
Really?
All right, okay. Well, I have an idea that I'm going to move forward on. I'm going to get the pictures of the legislators, starting with Greg Hughes, who were on that committee and made that decision. And I'm going to put them on a fan so that people can go into hearings and just fan themselves and then put it up like a mask. And there's going to be dollar bills coming from their ears and dollar bills coming down. So I'm moving forward on this idea. But you didn't hear it from me, right? And I should also mention that Jerry and I went to a hearing yesterday about the railroad that they are wanting to move ahead on. They have 3 different routes. In the proposal, it doesn't say that there's a possibility that they won't use any of them, but it's going to be $1.2 billion minimally for that railroad so that they can extract more fossil fuels and bring them into the inland port. There is a time period, I think it ends August 4th, where people can submit public comment, either in favor or opposed. So I have the information in my purse. If anybody wants that, please come up afterwards, because we need public input against this. And there were probably about 30 people that spoke yesterday, and of those, I would say 25 were in opposition, but still we need more voices. Thank you.
That's the kind of information that should be there in those checked-out tabloids in the supermarket.
Rosemary Holt this morning. May I ask Jim Debacus, can we impose on you? Will you suggest the most important thing we can do as individuals with the upcoming issues? Tell us, Jim. Guide us. Thank you.
Here's what I think. Every single issue we care about, homelessness, affordable housing, clean air, the port, comes down to this. And you know where it ranks? 17th on where people care in Salt Lake City on problems. They don't make the link. They don't make the link. and they've found ways around our current municipal election. You can take a maximum of $3,560. Look at some of my opponents. And I'm not pointing the fingers. Look, this is the rules, right? So you play basketball with the rules you have. So the job is to change the rules, so I'm not castigating anybody. But I'm saying $3,560 per corporation. So you've got one guy who makes 7 or 8 corporations, and you can look at them and see, and they're coming from the same person or the same family. Or one of my favorite ones, like I said, okay, here's this much money, you put it into radio buys or whatever. If you win, you pay me back. If not, I don't worry about it. And that's all legal. I can go down the list. So somehow we got to wake up our neighbors to say, all of these issues come back to who is paying. And I never took a dime from a corporation or a PAC or anybody when I was in the Senate. I want to bring that here, and I will make the first issue getting this solved as soon as we get a public financing law. I will bring it up as mayor, and I hope that all the other candidates will, because that's the foundation that everything else depends on. So we need to push all of our candidates, including me, to wake up. This is really, really, really important. Thank you.
Question is here.
Thank you so much for doing this today. It's very, very informative. And I didn't have any intention to ask a question or propose an idea, but it's just like it has to come out from me. So thank you for the opportunity. I want to say I really appreciate the young man who talked about what are the incentives for our elected officials to do the right thing for the right reasons. I loved your comment. About a month ago, we saw the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, a very old movie that just is very compelling. And as I was sitting here, I thought, how can we inform the public? Everybody loves entertainment. The entertainment industry has a very, very powerful effect. And I'm wondering what we might do to do some public showings of this nationwide in some of the independent theaters, get some folks out and do a question and answer on how we can apply that to our situation in our government today to raise the awareness of this very, very important issue.
Does anybody here have an answer for that? I think it's a great idea. Yeah, we need to keep it out there as an issue in many forms. It would be great if there was a remake with a little bit of a twist, bringing it up to date in terms of another movie. Yeah.
Robert Redford, Sundance.
Yeah, okay.
That's okay.
Okay, I have a question about small donors. It seems to me that one possible strategy, so what I've heard is that one value of small donors is that if somebody gives $5 to a campaign, they're likely to actually cast a vote for that candidate. And I wondered if you who have been thinking about campaign finance reform have any idea if that effect is strong enough to make that a likely strategy for winning, and if anybody has ever followed that strategy to try to encourage more small donors, and whether you know anything more about that as a strategy to win campaigns against big money.
It makes me think of the NYU study, the Brennan Center for Justice, which did a retrospective study of New York City's 1988 public financing system. They were the first in the country to do that. And then about, I think it's like 2 or 3 years ago, the Brennan Center for Justice did a follow-up study to see how effective that had been. And what they found was that there was more involvement from the voting public, there was more enthusiasm, there was a broader base of candidates. It was a very important distinctive finding there, that there were more candidates for office from a broader base, economically and so on. They did not find that it led to any major differences in who won and who lost. And so I don't think you can, I wouldn't venture to make any dramatic claims, about that aspect. But it was what the Brennan Center did was a fairly limited study of just one city and, a certain small number of elections. So it's hard to generalize from that.
This is perhaps an agenda item for the future, but you mentioned the role of smear campaigns and their distorting role in politics. Can you think of a comprehensive way of addressing this? Right now it's done by fact-checking during political speeches and during things, but that's done by one side or the other about the other side's claims. Would it be possible to establish some kind of nonpartisan, bipartisan, fact-checker service that operated during the closing, moments of any campaign to provide instant fact-check of that kind of smear stuff? Financed perhaps by the government. That's a good use for political dollars. And but it seems to me that would be really, really important. Can you develop something?
Well, I mean, PolitiFact, and some other websites are doing that on a very frequent basis, but
They're regarded as partisan entities.
well, I mean, when you say they are regarded as, they're regarded as, by, let's say, Trump supporters, because they accuse anybody of coming up with, some challenge as dealing in fake news and so on. So, I mean, they automatically just dismiss anything that's not favorable to them. But I think PolitiFact is doing a reasonably objective job of evaluating, the various statements that are made by politicians. And so that's available. The problem, Peggy, is that the general public isn't tuning into PolitiFact, right? I mean, that's the... There are, I noticed that better newspapers, like the New York Times, for example, or Associated Press or so on, now when they're reporting information, more and more, they're evaluating it right away. I mean, they're not wasting, they're not delaying. They're just coming, they're saying that, President Trump said such and such, and that's what he said was false, or what he said was a reversal of what he said the day before. See, so they're trying to keep pace with him. And I personally don't know that there's much more you can do.
But that's the New York Times. What about the
Right. But the New York Times and AP and so on are such leaders in the press world, in the world of journalism and so on, that I think I'm guessing that other newspapers will get on board bit by bit. There'll be this kind of gradual fact-checking. At least that's my hope. I don't know if it's a realistic hope or not, but I don't know what else one can do.
We have time for 2 remaining questions. Question here.
This isn't a question. I thought your presentation was fabulous, and I would kill to get the notes of your talks. And because there was so much information there, and I'm sure there are a lot of people here who would love to have that. Is there any way we could?
No killing will take place in this church.
No. Thank you, Tim. I was going to say the same. No, just come up to us, give us your email, and we're happy to provide all the information to you. Yeah, in Elliott Hall afterwards. Yeah.
Last question will be here.
Roughly the same question, though a slight variation on it. I've listened to what I ought to do, and of course I have really good intentions prior to cooking the salmon this afternoon and watching the Tour de France and then turning on Netflix. And by tomorrow, I will not be thinking about it. It would be helpful if you would fight in the same way that the throwaway papers do. That is, give me a one-sheet paper of the phone numbers I should call up when I actually get off it. I can put it on the refrigerator. If you make it neutrally enough, I can give it to some of my friends who, oddly enough, think they're going to vote for Trump. There aren't many of them, obviously none here. But if you gave me such a piece of paper, I'd make 100 copies of it, hand it out to friends, and then they would do the same thing with any luck.
Sir, consider yourself hugged. If you sign, we have a move to amend table in Elliott Hall, and we can do that for everybody. For everybody who signs up, we can provide that. I would like to meet with you afterwards to find specifically what you think is the most important to guide us. But I love the idea, so thank you.
With that, let's express appreciation to our speakers and also to Tristan.